Hello everyone, thanks for joining us on today's Odoo webinar. My name is Lisa and I'll be your host today. I know a lot of you guys are currently working from home, and that's why our team has organized a series of webinars, one each day, so that you can continue to keep updated with the Odoo community. If you want to register for the upcoming webinars, please go to odoo.com/events. Or if you want to rewatch some of the previous webinars that we've done, feel free to check out our YouTube channel. So the topic today is how Odoo can transform traditional companies' operations. And I think there's no one else better to join me for the discussion on this topic than my guest today, Jonathan Wilson, Chief of Sales and Innovation at WilldooIT Australia. Hi, John. Thanks for joining us from Melbourne.
Hi, Lisa. My pleasure.
So this isn't the first time that you've done an interview with Odoo, and I think you're pretty well known in the community with more than 20 years in the ERP implementation field and also one of the first to get onto Odoo. For those who are watching who might not know you yet, can you please briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. First I'm part of WilldooIT. As I said, we started writing our own ERP systems when I was just a lad. And we got very interested in Odoo because coming from a technical environment, understanding the complexities of ERP systems, we were very attracted to the technical aspects of the product. Back then, it was in 2008, it was called Tiny ERP. It wasn't a great name, very hard to market something like that.
That's right.
But we love the architecture that Fabian had put together, and we saw the potential for the product, and we're just happy and lucky that we got on the right horse, because that was back in version 5. Version 13's come a long way, and now it's a fantastic product functionally, and we still love the architecture, and we're still doing great work with it.
Well, thanks so much, John. And WilldooIT was actually the first gold partner in Australia for Odoo, and you guys have won multiple Best Partner Awards over the years. So could you tell us about WilldooIT, the PNOS group, and what's the strategy going ahead?
Sure. So we are part of the PNOS group, and we're Australian-owned enterprise with a global outlook. We're comprised of actually 4 companies, and we've all got a technology-based outlook. Our vision, put together by the board and the executive team, is to make growth through technology easy. So the 5 people you see there, they've all run their own successful businesses in the past. They've come together to form part of the management team for PNOS. 3 of those members have written their own ERP systems in the past. They've done the development, they've done the implementation, the documentation and support. So we have a long history behind us in this area, and obviously coming from green screens through Windows, through the fat client to the end-tier architecture of Odoo, we've come through a lot of transformations. We've had to renew ourselves several times. This industry changes rapidly, so we think we're in a pretty good position to talk about transformation.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's been a great pleasure working with you guys and meeting the board of the PNOS group at various roadshows before. But I think I want to get straight into the topic today, because it's a rather large topic, transforming traditional companies' operations with Odoo. And, in the last couple of months with the lockdowns going on around the world, I think we've seen a lot of companies really dramatically reduce in their revenue, purely because they aren't able to operate like usual. And especially traditional industries were heavily impacted because employees aren't able to work from home like you or I. So I'm wondering, what's your experience with that, and how are your customers doing?
Well, one particular company that I would like to highlight, or one of our customers, is Supply Partners. Supply Partners are a supplier of equipment and photovoltaic cells to the solar industry in southeast Queensland. They're one of the larger distributors. Actually, they have warehouses right throughout Australia. Of course, now when this hit, they were concerned about the solar industry, but that actually hasn't slowed down. But they were certainly concerned because they had to send all the management staff home. But it turned out to be an absolutely seamless exercise for them. They just had to leave a few of the skeleton staff in the warehouses to do the actual deliveries. And here's a quote from Patrick Morrissey. He's the director and owner and the operations manager at Supply Partners. And he was rapt because they just send their people home, left a few people in the warehouse. All the labels kept coming out. Everything happened as normal. The accounts people worked as normal, picking up, the invoices, outstanding invoices. The work just continued absolutely seamlessly. And I got this great quote. He rang me up and said, "Look, this has just been fantastic." So we were absolutely pleased with that. And truly, it's been the experience of a lot of our customers. They just took their computers home and kept working.
So you actually implemented Odoo for basically a warehouse situation, and was it involving a lot of the newer versions of Odoo where the IoT box comes into play, or?
Unfortunately not. This was done back in version 11. Okay. And we didn't have the IoT box then, but we still do things like print directly from, directly to their label printers from the cloud. And they've got their scanners. They're planning to do the scanners, shortly. It's been a long process for them. They were coming from a long way back, having several, having several unintegrated systems in place and very labour-intensive operations, and they couldn't keep control of their stock. They weren't communicating properly with their customers. That's all changed now.
Yeah, I think that really ties in, to the main concept of transformation that we talked about earlier. When we talk about transformation, it's a really broad concept, but I think, practically, what do you think this actually means?
Transformation, well, the key word in this topic, in this seminar is, of course, transformation. And I would like to put a little bit of a slant on it, and I'm going to talk about relationships. Now, it's not your relationships with your partner, but it certainly is about relationships with yourself, the company vision, relationships with your business colleagues, with your department, and last but not least, relationships with your customers. If you get all those relationships right, then you will have a transformative experience with your business. So the things I want to focus on are what happens when those relationships break down, why they break down, how to fix them, and what do good relationships look like and how they can transform your business. So I'm going to start with the last topic first. And I'm going to talk about traditional ERP systems because that's one of the words in the topic. Traditional ERP systems. Now, when we started, it was all about getting a general ledger to, take control of your accounts, do your profit and loss and balance sheet. Then they introduced accounts payable, accounts receivable, stock and purchasing, and then sales. That became the traditional ERP. And that was all about processes and automation. Of course, there is nothing wrong with that. We all need to, to make things as quick as possible with as fewer, manual inputs. But of course, the modern way to do things is much more about relationships.
Definitely.
It's more customer focused. You need to give that fantastic customer experience right from the point of contact through the website, through the CRM and your opportunities. The sales process has to be seamless. You've got to inform the customers when the goods are being dispatched either by SMS or email, and afterwards through the invoicing process, and certainly after that, with your post sales. So the whole process of talking to the customer was not part of the traditional ERP, but the modern systems. It's all about the social contact, keeping your customers up to date with what you're doing, telling them how their sales going, telling them how the project's going, what the status of it is. So those mechanisms to do that through email, through SMS, through customer portals, this is more the focus now, and that's what Odoo does fantastically.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's all about having great relationships with your customers. So I have described Odoo as a relationship machine. But it certainly is. I mean, when you look at that screen, you see a lot of little icons there, and you think, well, are they all behave in their own way? Well, yes, they do, but they all talk to each other, and that is a relationship. All those icons, if you have sales, that's great. You can just run sales and CRM beautiful. You put in the inventory. All of a sudden, your sales is talking to inventory. You put in finance. All of a sudden, it's creating invoices and you're creating your purchase orders, etc. So the system grows. So what I'm showing there is just the basic ERP. That's your sales, CRM, inventory, purchasing, finance, and manufacturing, perhaps. But when you put it all together, you get lines going all over the place. Now, when you put these lines together, it looks a bit stark, and it's not like that. They all talk seamlessly with very low impedance between them. So you get this effect where you have a very well-oiled machine where certainly, as if the whole becomes much more than the sum of the parts. It's one of those things that when it happens, it's a bit hard to describe, but it certainly does happen. But what happens when it breaks down? Well, what happens when it breaks down is you get lots of frustrated customers, you get lots of frustrated staff. They're having to do too much. They're not doing what they're trained for. They're too much manual operations, and it basically means you start focusing on the little things, not the big things, and the big things are about your customers and your business. So I've just a quick summary of things here. You start to get what happens when they break down. You get a lack of trust between the departments. There's a lack of trust, lack of transparency. But what happens is the sum of the parts just becomes a bunch of parts, and they're all trying to work together, but it's hard. And the business vision, that wonderful thing you had when you started up, becomes just a bunch of words because people get immersed in the day-to-day. So what does it take to transform your business? Well, first of all, you definitely have to have a clarity of where you want to go. And then you need to get all your internal and external relationships are working smoothly and serving the vision that you put together. Once you have all that happening together, something magical happens. And now, if you've ever been in a sports team that you've tried hard and you've come through and you've won the grand final, there's something more than training that does that. It's a bit of magic that happens on the day. It's very indefinable, but you know it happens. And that's what happens when the whole machine comes together and it's operating smoothly. And that magic can happen if you plan for it and you get your thoughts correct, and and you have the right software, and you have the right people working with you.
I think you've definitely captured that, and I think Fabian also, said something very similar at the last Odoo experience in Belgium. So besides having happy customers and a customer-centric kind of software that helps you manage that relationship, the employees' happiness is also very important. So reducing that amount of admin and wasted time with, trying to manually do data entry, I think something like Odoo can really help with that. And on the topic of, speaking about transforming a company, I think in your long career so far, you've come across many customers who, come to you guys asking for a solution. And I believe there are some common pain points that they're always presenting to you. So I'd like to, spend a bit of time discussing what are the common pain points that you see with these traditional companies that come to you guys for help.
Okay, sure. I've listed about 5 or 6 of them here, and I come across these all the time. Whether they be small companies or large companies, they all have similar problems. The first problem is they're running lots of third-party apps and then trying to make them talk together. At some point, the overhead of that just becomes too burdensome, and they just have to make a change. And obviously, a change into an integrated system can solve that. And certainly Odoo, can integrate all their workflows and procedures. So that is one common complaint, just too much overhead with third-party applications trying to talk to each other.
Okay, what are some of the common apps that you see, like the setups with multiple apps for your customers?
Okay, can we talk about names, can we?
I guess you can mention a couple, just the common ones.
Generally here in Australia we have products in like Xero and Maya, at the low end. There are some larger ERP applications out there, which have the same problems. I mean, they're certainly larger than Xero or Maya, but they all need to have, for instance, an e-commerce site and a customer portal. Well, that was not part of the traditional ERP, so they have to have another application that they have to hold on to it. Okay. And then you get this product, you get the problems. Well, now I've got my stock codes, I've got my images, I put them on my system, but now I've got to get them up to the website, and now they're out of date, they're out of sync. I have to have another person to look after my website as well as to look after the back end, and it just becomes too much of an overhead. And then all of a sudden things don't talk to each other, and the sales aren't coming through, and at some point they say it's too much. I can't grow. I've got to do something.
Right. I think that's also, very similar to what we have, experienced at Odoo ourselves. It's usually the case. What about the second one?
Okay, these smaller systems are meant to do one small job and do it well, but they're inflexible. You have to work day work. They're not very configurable. With a product like Odoo, it's very configurable, and of course, because it's an open source product, well, you can make it do whatever you like. You have to be careful about that. You don't want to change it a lot if you don't have to. You have to think creatively about how to use its features, and there are a lot there. But if you need to change it, you can. So in such an environment, you don't feel constrained. You will never outgrow the product. The product will grow with you, that's for sure, and that's a very important point. When people come along, they say, look, I'm just feeling constrained. It's going to be too hard to open another, to open another factory or another warehouse. It's just too much work. So you want a system that you feel has got the flexibility to grow with you.
Okay, flexibility is definitely a good thing, but have you had customers who, might have requested specifically for development that you thought could have a workaround in standard Odoo?
We always think that. We always say, look, before you do customization, let's think carefully, because we've come to know the system really well, of course, over 10, 12 years now. So we know there are creative ways to use it, and we always think creatively first. Whether they say, look, I would like to have a special way to manage this aspect of the business. It's a lot about communication. I said, well, how about the help desk? And they think, well, help desk, what do we use that for? So, well, you can set up a ticket for this branch of the organisation that has to deal with, I don't know, particular things that they need to communicate. They put it through a process, and they say, oh yeah, of course the help desk. But then you link the help desk up, say, with sales, and they've got sales complaints, and so Odoo becomes like like a plumbing set. You start to plumb all these things together, but you have to understand how it works. You have to have a very good understanding of what it's trying to do by itself, and then you think creatively and put these pieces together, and all of a sudden you have an application that might have needed a lot of customizations, but you've configured it in such a way that it's just using the base software very creatively.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for people who might be considering doing that. And the third one, you mentioned manual processes.
Well, yeah, and this is about key personnel too. So often with small companies, they come along and they've had people have worked with them for a long time, and they've got a lot of information in their heads, but it's in their heads. So if that person leaves or gets sick or retires, there's a real disruption. It's hard for the business owners, of course, because they think, well, what happens if this person leaves? He's got so much information in his head. The idea is to get the information out of that person's head, put it into the system, whether that's through better communication through the chatter or whatever, or through the tasks, because tasks can have a workflow. So really, there is aspects of Odoo which don't have anything to do with creating a sale or putting in a purchase order or doing a profit and loss. It's about getting those workflows that are in people's heads, taking them out of their heads, putting them into the system, having all the communication with the customer against the object, like against a sale or against the purchase order for the supplier or against the customer, getting it into the system. You sleep a lot better if you're an owner.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's even more relevant for smaller companies wishing to get to grow into a bigger one. Because with the expansion and the amount of people that's coming in, I think it's even more important to have that information documented.
That is absolutely true. It's a really overlooked issue. And of course, this is a classic too. People starting using multiple, spreadsheets all around the place. Now, they're great spreadsheets, and sometimes they get some really complex, spreadsheets, but they are inherently single user, and you inevitably ends up with little islands of information all over the place. So I had one customer, interior decorator, They were quoting for a large job, they did the job, they won the job, and then they had this terrible realisation that they'd quoted off last year's spreadsheet with last year's costs for the stock. That was a sort of catastrophic event, that led them to change. But hopefully you don't have to have that catastrophe. Hopefully when your systems are too complicated, you have to make a change and make the change before you have the catastrophe. But little islands of information on spreadsheets is a classic example, to know that you've outlived your current ERP and you need to make a change. The great thing about Odoo, of course, is all that information can be brought inside. If it's not there, natively, it can be of course programmed to be in there through a customization. But the beautiful thing about once you've done that, it all looks the same. So and you have all the resources there you can call on to really enhance that particular customization. But you can bring it all internally.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, how big was the size of the team of this customer that you mentioned with the interior designer?
They're a large company. They're the team. They had a 3 designer team. They had, 20 or 30 people on the manufacturing floor, and they did some large interior jobs.
Yeah, it's often a surprise to us as well. Like, we have larger customers who might still be working on Excel and Google Docs. So I think that's really interesting. And for the 5th one?
Well, here's the classic one where you can't grow because you've got an old system that's running on your server in-house. If you wanted to take it up to another state, what do? You say, okay, well, I'll get another version of that software. Then you've got the problems of, well, how do I link them all together? How do I see all my stock around Australia? It just becomes a pain. And so, to open another, branch takes too much work, it costs too much. And of course, you don't have any of those problems when you move to an integrated product, like Odoo. So you want to start up another company, great, you just flick a switch and you're there. Start up another warehouse, great, it's there. You want to move stock between the warehouses, just set up a couple of routes. You don't have those problems with growth. So, as I said before, the company won't outgrow Odoo.
Okay.
Or a product like Odoo. So the last one's a classic. So the last one brings everything together. What happens if you try to grow your company and you've got all these systems trying to talk to each other? You've got spreadsheets over here, you've got people with special information about how the company works. As you grow, as your turnover goes up, your gross profit goes up, but your net profit hardly moves because your overhead goes up at the same rate. Whereas if you put in an automated system that integrates all these functions as we've talked about before, gross profit goes up, but the direct overhead, for your wages, etc., and just and just the amount of effort it takes to run the company doesn't go up at nearly the same rate. And so what happens is your net profit goes up as your gross profit and turnover go up. And that is a real concern for people. For companies who try to grow, they realise they're stuck on the left-hand side, and they know they have to cut their overhead somehow, and they realise it's the systems that are holding them back. So that is a typical situation we come across.
I'm glad you brought that up, because recently I think we released a document or a tool that actually helps companies calculate the increase in their return on revenue from simply having a system like Odoo in place. And I think a lot of people, when they think of softwares or systems, they just look at what makes it easier in terms of operations. But actually, what's actually important is bringing more revenue or dropping the cost for a company. That's actually a very important point. Thank you, John. And if you could summarize the key factors for you for the transformation success.
Yeah. Well, look, this is pretty common sense, really. You have to know what you want. You have to think big, but you've got to be practical and divide it into milestones. You've got to select the right software. So you've got to select a piece of software that covers all the things we've just talked about. It has to be integrated. It has to be flexible. It has to be able to grow with you. You have to select the right software, but more importantly, you've got to select the right partner. So, you can have, pretty good software with good management and you'll have a success. If you put good software together with bad management, you'll have a failure. You put good software together with good management, you'll have a fantastic success. So you really, it's not just about the software, it's about the partner you choose, and it's about the team, the team that you put together. So it's the vendor team plus your team. So it's very important for you to assign an internal champion. There's going to be a lot of work for that champion to do. He's got to be the focal point that the vendor talks to. He's got to be completely behind the product, and he has to understand how the customer's business works. So it's really important to assign an internal champion, be part of the team. It is very much a team effort to get a successful implementation done. It can only go live when your team is trained and you're 100% confident that all your workflows have been tested and tried and you're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice for not only people who are thinking about implementing Odoo for your own companies, even for some of the partners that have joined our network recently who are learning how to implement Odoo for their customers as well. I think a lot of what you just mentioned there in the key factors for success really mirror the Odoo's implementation methodology, which you guys watching is also available on our website. I think that pretty much summarizes, John, your experience. And following this, I'd like to remind everyone that you can engage with us, leave your comments and questions in the live chat, and we'll attend to those at the end. But John, I know you have a couple more really interesting case studies to share with us. So I'd like to invite you to start with the first one.
Okay, this is Springer Solar. They're a family company. They've been operating for 20 plus years in southeast Queensland. They're one of the largest solar installers there. They had 4 warehouses, 2 locations, 4 POS terminals. They were running a couple of applications to run the POS, another application for the finance. They had a custom access database written to handle the workflow process from point of sale through the installation, etc. There was a new generation of Springers coming along. They wanted to grow the company. They knew that the overheads of doing it, their current system was just a pain. They didn't want to be sitting in the office all the time. They wanted to be out there on roofs and selling, doing the implementation. They selected us to do the implementation of Odoo. It was a 12-month implementation, but as you can imagine, having to replace all that and go live on the one day with everything ready to go was a challenge for both Springers and ourselves. But we did get there. We went live on the 1st of July, which is the first day of the financial year in Australia.
Right.
And they're wrapped. So there's a little quote there from Michael Springer. Odoo has allowed us to grow with little increase in overheads, which is just what I've been talking about. And will Odoo being a great partner. So thanks, Michael.
And could you describe a little bit of the implementation team on WilldooIT's side for this project? How many people are involved and what are the roles of some of these people?
We had the project manager, in this case happened to be myself. We had a very experienced, programmer also, because there are some very specific requirements in the solar industry with the, the solar tradable certificates, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some quite, I wouldn't say clever, but involved things to do. So we had a team of 2 to 3 on our side, and we had a very experienced project champion on their side, which made a huge difference. So he understood the complexities, and as you say in your implementation book, actually, that the process of going live is generally a bit of a J curve. Things go south before they start going north again.
That's right.
And that was certainly over the 12 months, but it all came together. But that was largely to the team, so our team and the project champion on Springer Solar, which he was very important.
And this project champion from Spring Solars, did they have an experience with ERP implementation before, or was this the first time?
And no, he was experienced. So he understood what we had to go through. He understood the pain points. He understood the advantages. He understood what it was looked like on the other side, he was just absolutely a great asset to us.
Yeah, great. That's amazing to know. And I think for those people out there with similar situations, it's really important to select, I think, the best point of contact from the customer side, and it's equally important having the project manager on the partner side or the implementer side.
Absolutely, really important, Lisa.
And for the second case study, you've got zero linear lighting systems.
Okay, yeah. So these guys design LED lights for large architectural, projects, banks and large buildings, etc. They started off from scratch, but they had a big idea. So they didn't start off with the small applications. They said, okay, we need an application that we can grow with. So this was we had 6 weeks to get this going from scratch. And they've got a company in every state around Australia. We had to do training. They have interfaces to CAD. Each company in every state puts in an order. It goes right the way through up the company hierarchy to the head office, which goes to the manufacturing branch. It was a complex setup, and we got that up and going in 6 weeks, thanks to our team internally. One of our senior programmers did a fantastic job. But they were up and going in 6 weeks. That was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. And they've been continually, growing ever since. They've moved into Asia, they've moved into Europe, and there's a quote there from Edward Sargent, DMD. The ability to tailor solutions for specific installations provides zero linear lighting group with a significant competitive advantage. So he was smart enough to have a vision for the company and see what was required to get there. Again, we had a good project champion on the other side who knew their business inside out, knew what he wanted, didn't know how to get there, but that was our part of the team, of course.
Okay. Well, 6 weeks is an amazingly short time. I think a lot of companies out there have this misconception that in order to set up an ERP that they can use, it usually takes a year, maybe sometimes 2 years. And this is true for some of the other software vendors out there. Could you tell us, in 6 weeks, did you get the whole thing up and running, or was it just the priority at the time of what they needed? And did the project continue to grow after that?
With 6 weeks, we had to prioritize. So we definitely had some milestones, and we knew what was important. We knew what they wanted on day one, because they had all these companies around each of the states. We knew what they had to have in place by day one. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. And of course, the standard functioning of the of your financials, that was already there. So we just had to put the multi-companies in place. The consolidation was happening automatically after that. But what we had to concentrate on was the sales side. So how could one of these branch offices or branch companies put their quote through, design it on the CAD system, get the designs back, and shoot that off to the manufacturing company. So that was what we had to focus on to start off with. And then of course once we had that groundwork in place, then we started to move forward in a controlled way to enhance the product. We've been going for 2.5 years now. We've still got some work to do because the requirements still grow. We can make them more efficient. We've just developed a wonderful long-term relationship with our customers like that.
Nice. And did you ever have to, at any point, challenge the customer on their priorities and what they needed to begin with?
With Odoo, you always have to challenge a customer, because it's like going into a toy shop. You say, "Oh wow, what can I do?" And you say, "Hold on, let's get the foundations in place. We're going to build a beautiful house for you, but we've got to get the foundations right." And so, it's very much as we have to tell them we have to discuss it with them, don't tell them. But we have to explain that, look, it's important to get the foundations right first. We'll set our milestones up, we'll get our vision right, and then we'll start to build it step by step by step. But it is, you can go a bit wild with Odoo when you see what's possible.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the approach that has ensured the success. And the quick going to production in 6 weeks, which is amazingly short for the first phase.
There was a lot of gnashing of teeth on our side, but we made it. Kagome is our latest product and definitely our largest customer. They're Australia's largest fruit and vegetable processor. They're up in Echuca on the New South Wales Victorian border. lovely little town if you ever want to visit there. They, of course, had made a couple of attempts to have an integrated system, so a system that would integrate all the manufacturing, all the, the live feeds from their machines and the hydrators and the heaters and all. They've got a beautiful, control panel there that looks like it's part of, like it looks like it's part of a nuclear power plant. It's just fantastic. But we had to integrate all those things, and so the whole process starts with the salesmen getting their contracts ready for next year. That drives when they're going to do their planting, when they're going to do their harvesting. As the trucks come through the door, we had to capture that information. As the tomatoes get poured into the processing plant, we had to capture that information. And then they have a unique way of storing all this, storing all the processed tomatoes. So this was a huge job. This was our, largest job. It involved a lot of customization, but of course, once you've done the sales, once you get to the sales side of things, then it becomes pretty much standard Odoo. But there was a lot of upfront work to handle the customer contracts, their unique way of storing, the goods in their warehouses. They haven't really got a warehouse; it's all out in the open there, but they just have rows and they store things in big, packs. That is one project we're very proud of.
Okay, and I think this is probably on the larger scale in terms of projects. We also see similar kind of case studies being implemented across, especially Southeast Asia countries, where food processing and production is actually a huge industry. So I think this is going to be a good case study, and we might have questions later on about more on this later. But for now, I want us to have a chance to go, to the last case study, which is in the timber industry.
Okay, we've been involved in the timber industry for the last 30 years. We had one of our traditional products called Timms, which is a leader in the timber industry in Australia. So we put Timms together with 30 years of timber experience that we've got. We added Odoo, and we came up with a new product called Timms, Timms Anywhere. That's our flagship product in the timber industry, and it is an absolutely transformative product in the industry. We're starting to move into Indonesia now and Singapore. But it's provided the timber industry with things they never had before. I mean, to have a website or have an e-commerce site that handles the complexity of the lots, the different profiles, the different lengths of timber within the lot, the splitting of the lot, the putting the lots back together. There are a lot of specific requirements for the timber industry, which on the surface look like they could be handled in standard Odoo, but if you look very carefully, there's a lot of complexities you have to deal with. So again, this whole process to convert our traditional Timms to the new Timms Anywhere took us about 2 years, believe it or not, but we've come up with a beautiful product called Timms Anywhere, and again, it's a product we're very proud of. It's actually applicable to more than the timber industry because it handles a lot of different units of measure, different lots. It can break lots, all the complexities of importing lots with different lot numbers and within containers. It's quite a sophisticated environment, but it's working beautifully now. And again, it's another product that we're extremely proud of, and it's a product we've been involved with for the last 30 years. So to see it being transformed and revolutionised and bring it into the 21st century has certainly been a gratifying experience for us.
Yeah, I think you guys are probably the only partners that I'm aware of who are engaged with the timber industry, and it's a great success story to see that you guys have this vertical solution now that can be applied not only in Australia but also other countries, and you've been doing so for your customers. So exactly. Congratulations on that success.
No, it's a great product. Thanks, Lisa.
And I think now we have a bit of time at the end of the webinar to open it up to the floor for questions. I'm just going to read out some of your questions now, so that John can have a chance to, have a look at them and see if he can answer some of those questions for you guys. One question that I've got is what is the recommended methodology to implement Odoo? Can you use business processes model to help, and how many people need to be involved?
That's a really good question, and of course it has a lot of dependencies. Depends on the size of the company to start off with. So if we're talking about 20, 30, 50 users upwards, you do need to go through a formal scoping process and gap analysis process, and then of course you've got all the you have to use all the business analysis tools that you're comfortable with to go through those processes, because a lot of the times, of course, people aren't aware of the complexities of their own processes. You have to map them first, and you have to analyse them and see where they can be improved. Smaller companies, it generally is too much of an overhead to do that. And Odoo is a beautiful product to just sit down with the customer, go through the workflows, use the studio to make any changes you have to make changes, to get to get the solution they want, and then to sculpt the solution around them. So it's a very dynamic process. So it depends, I would say. It depends on the size of the company, it depends on the complexity of the company, depends on, how formal they wish to be, depends how much they've got to spend. So there are a lot of dependencies, of course, but, larger companies, all our larger clients, we've had to go through that scoping process. We use the tools that that we've become familiar with and comfortable with, and some of the tools that are available that are quite widely used in the industry. But it is, but at some point we sit down and we just go through the workflows, because it's so easy to do that in Odoo. And we can use a studio tool to, if we have to make changes, we can, mock the whole thing up without actually going to the time or expense to actually make those changes or to implement the workflows. And so it becomes a much more dynamic process.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. What is your definition of traditional companies? Are those brick and mortar companies running legacy systems?
Yeah, traditional. I think I'm referring more to them. They're still, they're still running the legacy systems. So whether that means they're running on green screen still, or they're running in a Windows environment, but they're in they're running just, they're just running the finances, maybe the inventory, sales and purchasing. So that's the traditional environment, and it was generally run, on your Windows machines, or in the old days, be running on green screens. So that's what I said about traditional. It just is about managing your processes and managing your stock. It wasn't focused outward; it was focused inward. And of course, it had its place, but the world's become a lot more connected. You need a connected piece of software to handle it. So traditional is a funny word, I suppose, but I was more referring to the standard ERP, which is just your basic stock, sales, purchasing and finance.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I think, again, people will be surprised how many companies are still just running on paper and using every, documents to actually manage their finances and sales and invoicing. So,
well, I haven't met too many people who are still doing it on a bit of paper, Lisa. But
yeah, we do get quite a bit of those requests coming through. So don't be worried if that's describing your company situation. I think we can help you with that. And another question from the audience: in the context of business transformation, what would you share about the master data topic?
You mean the data migration of master data?
I'm guessing the question is regarding the management of the master data during the transformation process.
Okay, so now I'm interpreting this as how we do the data migration. And so, of course, the data migration involves the master data, your customers, your suppliers, your vendors, your stock items, and your prices and your preferred suppliers, and of course your chart of accounts, and setting up your banks. That's all what I consider to be master data. So that's the non-transactional data. We've actually developed a few spreadsheets to make that whole process a bit easier, although it is pretty easy already in Odoo because they've got this universal import facility, which is pretty flexible. We do find we need to train people in it though. That's why we've developed our own import routines to make that process a bit easier. When it comes to data migration for your opening balances, that's a little bit trickier. But again, we've developed our own spreadsheets to make that a bit easier to bring in your open invoices for suppliers, customers, your opening stock values, etc. So the data migration is a big topic, and one thing we avoid is taking on the responsibility of cleaning a customer's data. So oftentimes they're getting their data out of their old systems. They've had, their postcodes or their zip codes sitting in the suburbs, and they've got their names all scattered all over the place, etc. So, we don't take on that job of cleaning the data. We give them, a spreadsheet to populate, and it's their job to populate that spreadsheet, and we make sure that they can come into the system, it's coming in the right format, they've got their right relationships between the contacts and the customers. It's always a bit of an issue. Sometimes we have to go into some depth to explain the customer contact relationship inside Odoo. And so it's our job, we see it as part of the team there, to educate the customer.
Is that really usually quite a lengthy process to get clean data that you can use to import?
Oh, look, it can take months sometimes. It can be the slowest part of a project. And it's something that I always explain up front to the customer, look, this is going to take a long time in your situation because you have so much information to bring across. It's important that they realise that there's a lot of time involved from their side to get that in, because if we had to do all that for them, we could, but it would blow the cost of the project out.
Right.
So we avoid that, but we give them all the tools and the support and the training that's needed to bring that data in. We can offshore that we can offshore it if we have to, but it's really is the customer's job because they understand their data the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I think managing the expectation of the customer is critical to a project success, at least from Odoo's experience. And this actually ties into one of the next questions, actually. So someone's asking how transformation on the company can be adapted by the stakeholders. So in traditional companies, many key persons on particular process is very critical for operation. So I interpret this question as, in a company, especially a larger organization, there are many people who need to come together to make a decision about a particular process in the implementation. So in your guys' experience, how do you manage the situation where you have to interact with multiple stakeholders and not just one single point of contact?
Look, this is a $64 million question, change management. How do you get everyone on board? How do you not make it feel as though it's coming from the top down and we're going to enforce this on you? These are really good questions. And change management becomes a bit of a skill in its own right. Ideally, you want to get people involved as soon as possible. So obviously, the impetus to change, to transform comes from the top, but there'll be pressures coming up from underneath that have forced that decision on, that have forced that decision. So the idea is and it depends again on the size of the organisation. Most of the organisations we work with, there aren't hundreds of people. There are a few departments, and we just have to deal with each. We do have to deal with them each one in turn. So the first part of our job is to speak to people, is to listen. So once you listen, you've got to integrate all that information. Then you've got to present it back to them, and the idea is to get everyone on board. And that's again, if you can show them how the new system will look without implementing everything, you can get people excited because they see what it could look like. They see how much less work they're going to have to do. They see how they can apply their talents more to dealing with customers or more to looking after their stock without having to push against the system all the time. So ideally, you try to get people involved as soon as possible. Now, when you go live, that's when things, that's when people realise that the change is on them, and that becomes a skill in its own right at that point. And you have to be very careful with people within the organisation who are finding it hard to make that change, how to encourage them, how to keep them on board. So we're not talking about technical skills anymore, we're talking about people skills. And change management, people skills, project management, that's what's so important. They're the things you can't define, but the things that ultimately can often make a project a success or not.
Right. And I think, following that question, we see a lot of the time, the person who's a CFO or who's making the decision financially, it's not necessarily the person who's going to be using it on a day-to-day basis. So I think what you mentioned there is, getting the people who are the frontline sales guys or who need to use this every day to feel comfortable so that they can give either a good feedback or, champion the product internally. I think this is probably something that we see a lot more frequently with the success stories of our customers.
Yeah. Like it's a team effort again. So, so as many people you get on board on the customer side, that's great. There are constraints, of course. People have to run the business. But if you get people on board, sometimes you get, some recalcitrance and you have to manage that. But that's part of your people skills, not your technical skills.
Yeah, definitely. We do have another technical question though, so something to do with development. The question is, what proportion of time in the development of a project could be allocated to technical knowledge of Odoo to customize requirements? So I'm guessing that's saying how much time should you be dedicating to understanding the technical requirements and in terms of development.
Yeah. Again, look, there are some formulas out for this, and what the industry standards are. I think it comes out, like you should be spending 10 to 20% up front talking about requirements. Now, the word technical requirements was mentioned there, so that could have meant technical customizations. I'm not sure, but 10 to 20% of your time up front talking to the customer, writing, the project plan down, setting up your milestones, setting expectations, and then the rest, the last 20% is actually the time, when you have to go live, and the 60% in the middle is the implementation time doing customizations. Customizations are getting rarer and rarer these days. They certainly back when we started, back in version 5 or 6, it was mostly customizations. But now there are very few customizations. Most people can work Odoo out of the box. Especially large customers have some very specific requirements. So look, I think it follows pretty much along the standard lines: 10 to 20% up front, another 10 to 20% of change management and going live and getting your opening balances in, etc. And the rest is just the just the project management, the configuring the system,
Okay.
Working with the customers.
So
The customizations now probably account for the actual doing of the customizations. Probably accounts for 10, 20, 15%, some of that order. And some of our customers now have no customizations. It's just all out of the box. We try to cater for all level of our customers, from those that, from 2 users to hundreds. The 2 user level, you don't have any customizations at all. 10 to 20 users, you're starting to get a few, maybe report customizations and things like that, or something specific. But it's getting fewer and fewer. But of course, we do have large customers, and that's where you do need a good technical, in-depth understanding of the system, so you don't start working against it. It's important to work with the system. To work with the system, you have to understand it very well.
Yep, absolutely. That's really important to know. I think for people out there who are thinking about implementing Odoo especially, to not jump straight into development and customization, but as John advised, to really understand Odoo standard first and foremost and figure out ways on how to use it. to cater to the requirements. So another question from the audience, John, how can you prepare your implementation strategy for smooth data migration synchronously and to cater or to keep in mind of the cutoff period or the deadline?
Really good question. Really good question. Look, ideally, and with that large Kagami site, we automated the whole process. But it took us 3 months to automate that process. For a once-off event, it took us 3 months to automate it. Ideally, what we do, so there are no surprises, but generally, you go live over a weekend, and people are working Friday night, Saturday, and Saturday, and on Sunday the system's being tested. So prior to that time, you want to have tested everything. So you've got your master files in there, you're happy with all of those, you've got your customer suppliers, you've got your stock codes, you've got your variants, you've got your preferred suppliers, that's all in there. So what you're talking about that last few days is getting your opening balances in and reconciling everything, bringing your opening balances for your general ledger to a certain point in time and then going forward. So you want to have tested all that stuff before you go live on the weekend, because you'd be surprised at the number of times you've got your opening invoices for your customers sitting over here, and you bring them in and they don't reconcile for some crazy reason. We want to sort all those issues out before the go live day. So we always insist that people do a trial data migration for their opening balances, and so there are no surprises when we do go live.
Okay, how much leeway would you say to leave between the trial and the actual go live date?
Well, we generally, make sure we've done the trials and then we set the go live date. We don't say, okay, we'll do the trials this week and we're going to go live on the weekend, because you just don't know what you're going to come up against.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think that's it. We've got, a couple of minutes left. Thank you, John, so much for sharing, experience and knowledge. And we look forward to actually meeting you again in person once this is over, so that we can be in Australia, or, we can actually see you at one of the roadshows. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As a reminder, we have more webinars coming each day this month, and please go to odoo.com/events to register for the upcoming events. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Bye.